So I'll pick matters up again at the end of 1981, and we're going to look at some correspondence about some of the late attempts in late 1981 and into 1982 to determine whether or not PFC might be able to fractionate plasma for England. There's a letter from the 21st of December 1981 that I won't take you to, sir, but it's worth noting for later. It's a letter from an official in the DHSS to the SHHD pressing for information on how much English plasma the PFC could fractionate. So for your note, the reference for that is SCGV 502_032.
No. 6 zeros must be.
You're quite right, sir. I'm sorry. 6 zeros.
And underscore?
032. Thank you. I will take you to the response to that letter, sir, as it contains some important figures which play out in the decisions that followed on. So it's CBLA 301532. Now, this is a letter of the 11th of January 1982 from a Scottish Home and Health Department official responding to the DHSS. I'm not going to take you through all of it, sir. I just wanted to highlight a couple of passages. This is a letter which follows on a telephone call between the two officials, and that explains some of the drafting. If we could go to paragraphs 2 and 3, I won't read it out, but paragraph 2 sets out some recent developments on the shift working issue from the perspective of this official. Picking matters up at paragraph 3, the official said this. Secondly, I pointed out during the telephone call, that the PFC Liberton could process substantial quantities of English plasma only if further ancillary facilities can be provided, and that more land will be needed for the building required. There's suitable land adjacent to PFC, but it belongs to the Lothian Health Board. And there's a question about whether or not it could be bought. Before plans could be made to expand production at Liberton, it will be necessary to ensure that the land for this can be made available. And if we then go over the page to paragraph 6, there's some more detail at the start of that paragraph on what this official suggested the PFC might be able to produce and what might be necessary for the PFC to be able to produce it. And it finishes with the sentence, we estimate that the total expenditure called for would be of the order of £6 to £7 million. But we cannot give you a detailed breakdown of this at present. And the last point to highlight from this document is at paragraph 8. If we could just go down slowly, please. Thank you. And just the last sentence of that paragraph, we estimate that the necessary building work could be completed in 2.5 years. Now, we're going to come back in a later document, and in fact, probably a series of documents as the presentation goes through, about what that £6 to £7 million represents, because on the face of it, it seems like a surprising figure when considered against the background of the documents that we've just been looking at this morning. What will become clear is that a significant part of that figure, in fact, relates to modifications which were thought to be necessary to be made to the PFC as a result of reports by the Medicines Inspectorate, mainly a report in October 1981. We'll come to that report later on in the presentation, but it makes various recommendations and points about what needs to happen at PFC. A lot of that figure, the 6 to 7 million, in fact, relates to that report. It doesn't come out from this letter, but it will come out from another letter that we'll look at in just a moment. Before we get to that, taking things chronologically, so I'll note that a couple of months later, in March 1982, the Policy Steering Group which was looking at options for redeveloping BPL, met. It was agreed at that meeting of the group that as the PFC would not be able to fractionate any substantial quantity of English plasma without the introduction of a 3-shift working system, plans for redeveloping BPL should not proceed on the assumption that PFC would process plasma for England and Wales. We can take this document down now, please. Thanks, Sally. So in other words, an assumption is being made, a decision is being taken, at least by the policy steering group, that the PFC would no longer feature in plans for UK-wide fractionation. So I should at this point just flag a correction that needs to be made to the written note. There's paragraph 52 of the written note refers to a 4th of March 1982 letter and suggests it comes from Professor Cash. My apologies, that's a mistake. In the written note, paragraph 52 can effectively just be struck through. The next paragraph in the note correctly summarises that letter, which in fact comes from a DHSS official, also on 4th of March 1982. So for those who might be reading the written note, paragraph 52 can effectively be struck through. A correct summary of the letter follows on, and it's a letter of the 4th of March 1982. It's about the recommendation of that steering group. In April 1982, a meeting of the committee which was looking at these options for redeveloping BPL took place, and the steering group's recommendation was accepted. That recommendation, as I said, effectively being that BPL redevelopment should proceed on the basis that PFC would effectively be put to one side and that PFC would only be fractionating plasma for Scotland and, as we'll see later, for Northern Ireland. In the written note, we've summarised some departmental documents which appear around this time in which DHSS officials anticipate that their counterparts in the Scottish Home and Health Department will be concerned that there might be attempts to recoup the money that was invested, especially if it's inflated. I don't need to take you to those documents, sir. The next important point in the chronology is around September 1982, when a draft ministerial submission is prepared on options for redeveloping BPL to go to the minister. I believe it was Mr. Finsburg. I don't need to take you to the draft submission. I will highlight one point that's made in it, and I'll just read it out. It was said in that draft submission, in the view of DHSS officials, it remains highly doubtful whether a shift working agreement can be negotiated with staff at PFC without serious repercussions on pay of other groups in the NHS and the industrial civil service. I will take you, sir, to a letter which comments on that draft submission and which comes from a Home and Health Department official. Study, it should be at DHSC 302333_018. So this is a 15th of September 1982 letter from Mr. Walker at the Home and Health Department to the DHSS. I'd highlight the second paragraph in that letter, which begins, I note, not without some sense of relief, that you've ruled out PFC Liverton as a source of supply for England and Wales. It's not immediately clear to me, sir, why this official was expressing a sense of relief that PFC was being ruled out as a source of supply for England and Wales. There may be inferences which could be drawn, so I'll probably just leave that point for now. I just highlight it for your note. The official then goes on to address the earlier figure of 6 to 7 million that I flagged a moment ago in the paragraph that begins, the impression is given, and this is commenting on the draft submission. It says the impression is given in lines 5 to 7, that the capital investment of 6 to 7 million would be required solely for the processing of English plasma. In fact, about half this sum will have to be spent in any case to fractionate plasma for Scotland and Northern Ireland to Medicine Inspectorate standards. And there's a reference back there to a letter in which that point was explained. I'd also highlight the penultimate paragraph. I note also that you've expressed a pretty firm line in the last sentence of the paragraph on the shift working issue. As the official had said in a previous letter, we here take the view, in the light of the known attitude of the main Scottish Union official involved, that an acceptable agreement can be negotiated, though not without difficulty. I am a little unhappy about the decision on this topic being based to any material extent on the concept of shift working being too difficult for the NHS. Now, it's not clear, sir, from documents surrounding this letter that there had been any real progress in trying to resolve the shift working issue. If there are documents which help clear that up, we haven't identified them. What we have is this Home and Health Department official suggesting that this was a problem which could be overcome, and at least these decisions about redeveloping BPL shouldn't be taken on the basis that it couldn't. That's it for that document. Thanks, Sally. I note, and this is covered in the written presentation, around this time, so around September 1982, it seems that the DHSS abandons the idea that it will ever be able to recoup the money that it invested in PFC. There's reference to the £400,000 being put to one side on a knock-for-knock understanding of interdepartmental transfers. I understand that to mean there are so many transfers of money between the two departments. In essence, these things all come out in the wash, and there weren't going to be concerted efforts to try and get that money back from the Scottish Home and Health Department. Now, we then get, in later 1982, to final decisions being taken about these issues. We can see that in a 15th of October 1982 submission to the Scottish Health Minister, and we'll bring this one up. It's SCGV 40/147_114. Now, this is a document from October 1982, authored by that same official we were just looking at, Mr. Walker. We can see at the top that's going to the private secretary to Mr. Mackay, who was the minister with responsibility for health in the Scottish office at the time. I'll just read out and point to a few passages. It begins with, as Mr. Mackay is aware, the possibility has been under consideration for some time of using the PFC in Edinburgh for processing blood plasma from England. If we can then go down to paragraph 2, the official suggests this in the first line. It's always been clear that the DHSS and English NHS interests concerned would prefer, other things being equal, to redevelop the BPL on a basis which would take England and Wales, which would make England and Wales fully self-sufficient in this field. There's then a summary of the submission that's going to the Minister in England and Wales and an outline of the problems, and we can see in paragraph 3.2 a reference to the shift working issue as being one of the obstacles. And if we pick up paragraph 4, so the bottom of this page, Mr. Walker says the financial calculations involved are quite finely balanced, i.e. the financial calculations for the different options under consideration. He then says this: we are conscious too that although we take a more optimistic view than DHSS of the, and over the page, please, Sully. Thank you. Of the shift working issue, and then refers to the shift working experiment that was carried out in late 1981. There is still much work to be done before a scheme acceptable to all interested parties can be developed. It's a bit difficult to read this, the copy's faint. I think it says,
indications.
Thank you. The indications were that the trade union mainly concerned,
Astom's,
thank you, might be persuaded to reach an acceptable agreement on shift working, albeit following hard bargaining over hours of work, staffing levels, and so on. But the current pay dispute has introduced an element of militancy which makes understandable the DHSS reluctance to back an option which relies on union cooperation. There's then reference to an officer of the relevant union who's reported as having urged the desirability of developing the PFC and creating additional jobs when there was a ministerial visit, a ministerial meeting rather, but also recording that that individual's union had never committed itself to the changed working practices required for this purpose. Paragraph 5, in the circumstances, we think that the possibility of handling English material at the PFC has been sufficiently considered that we should accept the conclusions of DHSS and Mr. Finsberg that the balance of advantage for them lies in developing the BPL to cover English requirements, and that action in Scotland should now be concentrated on identifying the improvements needed at the PFC to enable Scottish and Northern Ireland plasma to be processed in conditions which fully satisfy the requirements of the Medicines Inspectorate. In November 1982, there was a document summarised in the written note, we're all done with that now, thanks, Sully, in which the Minister's agreement to that recommendation is recorded. And what's said in that document, and I'll just read it out, it's recorded that Mr. McKay, the Minister, had accepted that BPL should be redeveloped to meet English processing requirements and that the PFC should concentrate on fractionating Scottish and Northern Irish plasma. And we're going to be turning next to look at the arrangements involving Northern Ireland. Now, in the written note, we've set out some views of various individuals involved on these issues of UK-wide production cooperation between England and Wales and Scotland. I'm not going to repeat those now. There's some more detail in Annex D to the note. But what we have seen, I hope so reasonably clearly, is a significant shift in the time period that we've just been looking at from 1965, when the agreement seems to begin, to 1982, when the agreement comes to an end. So that's all I intended to cover on that particular issue. I know we've taken some time doing it. There are a number of documents I wanted to bring up. I hope that we'll now be able to move a little more quickly through some of the remaining topics. And given the time, I will make a start on the next area that I intended to cover, sir, unless there's anything else you wanted to discuss on this issue. That's the arrangements for Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
So for those who are following the written note, we're now in section 3 of the note. As I've said, this will be a shorter part of the presentation than the one we've just covered. I should emphasise that that is absolutely not because the arrangements involving Northern Ireland and the issues surrounding them are in any way less important than the issues we've just been looking at. It's partly because there are fewer documents, partly because the documents are clearer and we've summarised them and set them out in the written note. And it's also in part because we have heard some evidence from at least one individual who is directly involved in this, Dr. Maurice McClelland, sir, who has provided statements as well as giving oral evidence to the inquiry already, and who was present during the time when there was a transition from English fractionation to Scottish fractionation of Northern Irish plasma, who was directly involved. And you've also considered evidence relating to some of these arrangements during the presentation on the Belfast Haemophilia Centre. I'm going to refer back to a few points from that evidence that we've already heard, but I hope that helps to explain for those who are listening why we may move through this part of the presentation a little more quickly than the material we've just been looking at. Now, by way of background on the arrangements in Northern Ireland, there are just a few points I should pick up, in particular for those who may not have been present during previous hearings. The first key point is that between 1972 and the late 1990s, Northern Ireland was governed by direct rule from Westminster. There was a blood transfusion centre in Northern Ireland based in Belfast, which was part of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service. Colonel Field was director of that service from the late 1960s to 1980. In June 1980, he is replaced by Dr. Maurice McClelland, who's given evidence to the inquiry. Northern Ireland had a haemophilia centre based at the Royal Victoria Hospital. It was designated a reference centre in September 1981. Dr. Elizabeth Main joined it in 1968, was its director from 1978 through to the 1990s, and Dr. Main has provided a number of statements to the inquiry. Now, during the period that we're going to be looking at now, the 1970s and the 1980s, Northern Ireland could produce cryoprecipitate at the Belfast Regional Transfusion Centre for its patients, but it didn't have the facilities for producing factor concentrates. Dr. McClelland, in one of his statements to the inquiry, explained the reasons for this. Essentially says, with a much smaller population of around 1.5 million, it was not realistic to expect that the enormous amount of resource that would be necessary to build a fractionation centre would also be spent in Northern Ireland as in other parts of the UK. What the evidence suggests is that until 1982, when there was a transition, the Haemophilia Centre in Belfast received relatively limited quantities of concentrate from BPL and PFL in England. In one of her statements to the inquiry, Dr. Main described this as being largely on the basis of a good relationship that she had with Dr. Lane and Drs. Bidwell and Grant. The evidence suggests that the Belfast Haemophilia Centre wasn't charged for these products. It also suggests that Northern Ireland did not send any fresh frozen plasma to England. In other words, it was receiving a relatively small amount of factor concentrates produced in England, but it wasn't sending any fresh frozen plasma. Now, Dr. McClelland, that's Dr. Maurice McClelland, told the inquiry that after he was appointed as director in June 1980, he began investigating the possibility of Northern Ireland supplying fresh frozen plasma. Initially, he was looking into the possibility of fresh frozen plasma being sent to England. But during that year, 1980, consideration began to be given to a change in approach whereby any fresh frozen plasma from Northern Ireland would be sent not to England, but to the PFC in Scotland. There's a meeting which took place in December 1980 involving officials from the various departments. It may be useful if we just turn to the minutes of that meeting very briefly. It's DHSC 5064. And if we could go on to the second page, please, we can see a list of attendees. Officials from the departments, health service departments in the different parts of the United Kingdom. There's some discussion during the course of these minutes of the role PFC could play. So we're still in 1980 in UK-wide fractionation. And there's a suggestion during the meeting the PFC might fractionate Northern Irish plasma, and that is on the next page, page 3. and it's paragraph 6 and 7, where it said there was a possibility that ultimately PFC might be able to meet up to half the UK's requirements of blood products, so that links back to some of the issues we've been considering. And it was agreed that the question of how future UK fractionation might be divided between BPL and PFC would have to be discussed in detail once total requirements have been defined. One possibility might be that PFC would fractionate plasma from the 4 Northern English regions and from Northern Ireland. Dr. Acton, who is an official in the Northern Ireland part of the DHSS, agreed to look into this issue effectively. So that's an early reference to this transition which eventually took place from fractionation in England to fractionation in Scotland. Now, we don't need to go to the document, but around, soon after this meeting in February 1981, there was a visit to the PFC by Dr. Maurice McClelland and a colleague to discuss possible changes to the arrangements. That visit was recorded and set out, we don't need this document anymore, thanks, Holly, in a February 1981 letter, which was from Mr. Watts to Professor Cash, sets out what was discussed during the meeting, what might need to take place before Northern Ireland could start sending fresh frozen plasma to Scotland, and what would need to take place before the PFC was able to fractionate it. I won't take you to the document, sir, but it was suggested in that letter that the PFC expected to receive less than 600 kilos of plasma per month from Northern Ireland, of which half would be time-expired plasma. The main obstacle or main issue that needed to be overcome before the arrangements could start, one of them at least, seemed to be the testing for hepatitis B that was then being undertaken at the Belfast Centre, and there needed to be a change to an updated version of testing, radio immunoassay, RIA testing. That's also recorded in that letter. At that time, Mr. Watt thought that that might be achievable by around September 1981. Now, in early 1981, February 1981, there were further meetings between the officials who were involved. One of the themes that emerges and that perhaps provides some impetus for this transition from BPL fractionation to PFC fractionation is that around this time, BPL is intending to introduce a pro rata system for blood products. In other words, transfusion centres would receive blood products in proportion to the amount of plasma that they provide. Because at that time, the Northern Ireland Centre did not provide any fresh frozen plasma to BPL, it would under the pro rata system, it would not be receiving any factor concentrates in return. It seems that it might have been providing some time-expired plasma, sir, but no fresh frozen plasma for factor concentrates. During the course of 1981, in the spring and the summer, there's a series of steps that begin to be taken by the relevant officials involved to try and formalise this agreement, to try and move things forward. All of those are summarised in the notes, and I won't take you to them. And in September 1981, Professor Cash prepares a preliminary report about fractionation at the PFC of Northern Irish plasma, and I will take you to that document relatively briefly, sir. It should be at SCGV 40104_117. So we can see from the title it's about SNBTS fractionation of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service. The initials at the bottom there, JDC, John Cash for Professor Cash, and it's dated September 1981. it's a reasonably detailed report, so it may be worth returning to later on. I'm not going to go through it all now, but if we go on to page 2, and the second half of the page, statement of Northern Ireland need, there's a summary of the amount of plasma that Northern Ireland was hoping to send to PFC for fractionation. Then over the page, page 3, and the second half of the page, there's a suggestion that with the figures that were proposed to be provided by Northern Ireland, it would be possible for PFC to fractionate them with its facilities and the work patterns that were in place at that time. But a suggestion in both of those passages that if the amounts increase, it may be necessary for some modifications to work patterns and arrangements at PFC. If we go over the page to page 4, and the bottom of that page, Professor Cash sets out the amount of blood products the Northern Ireland Centre could expect to receive. He suggests at the bottom of that page that there may be a gap between plasma starting to be provided and products being provided in return. And over the page, Professor Cash gave some estimated figures for the amount of factor 8 and factor 9 that the Northern Ireland Centre might expect to receive. And lastly, if we go to page 6, at the top of the page, Professor Cash summarised the issue relating to hepatitis B testing. And he then provided the following comments. If we go down a little bit, comments on above, Professor Cash said that there's still much work for the staff of PFC and NIBTS to do, and considerable investment will be required by the NIBTS and the Belfast Centre. However, the resolution of the important matters referred to above will take some time and should not, with the exception of improved hepatitis B testing, be factors which delay the onset of the proposed programme. And he suggested there's no doubt that the PFC would be able to fractionate up to 12,000 kilos of plasma a year. Now, there's some suggestion in documents from the following years, so from 1982, the spring of 1982, some thought is being given to whether or not it's going to be necessary for the PFC to make changes to its fractionation arrangements. I'm going to take you to one document that relates to that. It's a minute from the 7th of April 1982, and it's at SCGV 40104 _ 101. Now, this would appear to be certain internal minutes by SHHD officials commenting on some of these proposed changes. I brought it up partly for your note because it's worth looking and considering what's said about PFC's capacity in the first paragraph. Some suggestion in the second paragraph that the proposal for PFC to fractionate Northern Irish plasma is being considered alongside possible changes to the shift working agreements. So the shift issue is arising again, both in the context of plasma fractionation from England, but also while these different arrangements are being considered for Northern Ireland. Now, it appears from the documents that plasma begins to be sent, fresh frozen plasma begins to be sent from Northern Ireland to the PFC later in 1982. We don't have the exact dates. There's a meeting on the 26th of August 1982, and we're done with this document now, thanks, Sally, that Dr. McClelland was taken to during his evidence. I won't go to it again. In that, the minutes of that meeting in August 1982, there's discussion of these changing arrangements. They don't make clear whether or not plasma was as yet being sent from Northern Ireland to the PFC. In his oral evidence, Dr. McClelland thought that it would have commenced shortly after that meeting, so shortly after August 1982. He suggested it was perhaps a couple of months later. We do have a record of a meeting which happened on the 15th of September 1982. I don't need to take you to it. That meeting noted that batches of Northern Irish plasma had been satisfactorily processed at the PFC, suggesting that by the time we get to September 1982, fresh frozen plasma had been sent from Northern Ireland to the PFC. Though it also suggested that there were financial arrangements that still needed to be worked out. As for when, in return for the fresh frozen plasma, the PFC began supplying blood products to Northern Ireland, again, we don't have exact dates. We might have an indication in an annual return for the Belfast Haemophilia Centre, and I'll just bring that up. It's HCDO 30-1596. Now we can see that this is the annual return for the Belfast Centre for 1982. Dr. Main is the director. And if we look at the entry for NHS factor rate, there's a figure given of nearly 13,000, and then in brackets it's noted only available for November to December 1982. So it's not totally clear because the provenance of the concentrate isn't specified, but what that may suggest is that the Belfast Centre wasn't receiving any NHS concentrates during most of 1982 until November and December, when the PFC starts sending some of its factor rates to Belfast. Dr. McClelland, during his oral evidence, was asked about the reasons why it took around 18 months for this arrangement to be put into place, going from February 1981, when there seems to be an agreement in principle that there should be Scottish fractionation of Northern Irish plasma, to later 1982. I won't repeat all his evidence. It's worth noting for those who are listening, he pointed to a mixture of different issues. He said that there were administrative issues that needed to be overcome, operational reasons, the hepatitis B testing points that I've already described. He also said that the Belfast Transfusion Centre needed to do some work, buy some equipment, commission equipment to make sure that it was able to supply fresh frozen plasma to PFC in the way that took place. It's important to note that this arrangement was on a pro rata basis. So the Northern Ireland Centre would receive factor concentrates from the PFC, but it would only receive them in proportion to the amount of plasma that it supplied. It was also charged for the products that it received. We've set out in the note a bit of detail about those financial arrangements. I'm not going to go into that detail now, so it may be worth considering later. It seems that there was some tension in the 1983 to 84 period because there was a sense that there had been a delay in finalising financial arrangements. They were eventually resolved. They arose again in 1985. Professor Cash had some concerns that the PSC was not being compensated fairly for the work it was doing to fractionate Northern Irish plasma. He has some correspondence with an official from the Scottish Home and Health Department. It seems that his concerns were addressed. Again, so the detail of all that is set out in the written note. Now, that's not it for Northern Ireland. We're going to be returning to issues affecting Northern Ireland as I move on to the next sections of the presentation, in particular when we're looking at supply, what factor concentrates PFC was producing, where it was sending them to. But for that standalone section, sir, that's all I wanted to address you on. I note that it's very nearly 4:30. I wonder if that's a convenient moment to break.
Yes, well, I think it probably would be. So we'll start again at 10 o'clock tomorrow when we'll hear the balance of your presentation. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow.